Hello, everyone. I'm Lawrence Weschler, and I'm, along with Bill, the curator of the whole festival. We're so glad to have you here. As you know, this is the second day of the 5-day James Baldwin, this time, festival here at New York Live Arts. And it is the beginning of a year of Baldwin, which we are doing with Columbia University's School of the Arts and with Harlem Gatehouse. So you'll be hearing a lot about Baldwin all through the years. This would have been his 90th year, and those of us who are putting this on just feel that he is arguably one of the most important, certainly the most salient, most pertinent voices of his generation, and is urgently needed now. And so that's what we're trying to do. We've had some changes in the panel, as you probably will have recognized if you're looking for particular people. Giovanni Williams has been, one of the troubles of having a politician is that he gets called away on politics. And we're going to have a conversation about politics here, but if you're going to have an actual politician, you may not have him when you need him. But he sends his regards. Five, Mualamic also has had an emergency, wasn't able to come. However, we have some great people for this particular panel, which, as you know, is the one where we're going to talk about, it's the title panel of the whole festival. And we're calling it James Baldwin This Time. Precisely what would James Baldwin make of our time today, and what would he demand of us? How would he read us today? So let me just tell you quickly who is on stage. Some of them are in your brochure. Nancy Goldstein, I think she's in the leaflet, I believe. I'm not giving long introductions just so we can get directly into the business. Rich Blint, who I think is also in the folder, is one of our curators as well. He is running the operation at Columbia School of the Arts. He is a Baldwin scholar and he's a wonderful resource. Karen Finney, now with MSNBC. She's written about in your program. Maya Wiley, who is now the counsel to the mayor. In earlier events, we've had like 5-minute introductions, but I thought the way we'd start today is we do have a little piece of Baldwin talking from The Price of a Ticket, the wonderful, wonderful Baldwin documentary. So just to remind us who we're talking about here, why don't we show that for starters?
We don't even have a country. I know that. Do we have a country? You think that's your country, which is not your country? You have no flag, brother.
A boy last week, he was 16, told me on television. Thank God we got him to talk. Maybe somebody will start to listen. He said, I got no country, I've got no flag. Man, he's only 16 years old. And I couldn't say you do. I don't have any evidence to prove that he does.
He was the person who had initially, or one of the first people, to cry out what we were feeling and in fact, what we were going to feel and what we were going to do. He was one of the first to articulate it.
And the moment you are born, since you don't know any better, every stick and stone and every face is white. And since you have not yet seen a mirror, you suppose that you are too. It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace, and to which you owe your life and your identity, has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you.
Yeah, thank you. If Karen is Karen here right now? Karen's right there. She was the director. So, rather than 5-minute opening statements, I think I'll just begin with if Baldwin were alive right now, what would be some things he would think about? And I think obviously one of the first things to talk about is the fact that we have a black president. And Rich, you have actually a story about that's a famous story.
Well, it's not my story.
Yeah, but
Did you
just
guys hear me? Any chance? No.
wait, just say we're
I got Michael later on. So.
Yeah. Let's see. Is he?
I think I heard you might be up.
He's working on it.
Testing 1, 2. I didn't take one of those.
Yeah, you just give him that for the time being. There you go.
Oh, thanks. It's not
Not your
actually
story,
my
but-
story, but it's a story that's been repeated for some time. And we had Kathleen Chalfant this morning and Jimmy at High Noon reading beautifully from Sweet Lorraine, which is included in Raisin in the Sun, which is now on Broadway. And in Sweet Lorraine, Baldwin talks about his dear friend with such, I guess, just sincerity and such compassion. But you mentioned in that piece about how unhappy she was about her meeting with Bobby Kennedy in 1963. And the story goes, Bobby Kennedy wanted to talk about the black situation, and Baldwin agreed to have an audience with him. We had a meeting recently with Harry Belafonte, who called Baldwin naive for thinking that, what do you think he'll get? I mean, to be colloquial for a second, in a conversation with the president's brother. And Baldwin went the same way he was foolish about, and I'm saying foolish in a kind of advised, qualified way, about going to Hollywood to make that film about Malcolm X, right? Everyone thought it would fail. So when he met with Bobby Kennedy, he came out very disappointed. He also had a guy named Jerome Smith in the room who did a lot of freedom rides and all that kind of stuff. And Jerome broke the silence by telling Bobby Kennedy about the people that Baldwin just talked about, right? The kids whose corpses, as Baldwin says, are piling up in the street for no reason at all, for not anything they had to do. And so he says after this meeting, he met with Kenneth Clark, and he says, Bobby Kennedy recently made me the soul-stirring promise that in 30 years, if I'm lucky, maybe I can be president too. And he says, it's never entered this boy's mind. He calls Bobby Kennedy a boy. Interesting, right? It's never entered this country's mind yet that perhaps I wouldn't want to be. So what really exercises my mind, he says, is what kind of country he would be president of. I think that's the question, as I've been saying and all this way through. Like, we're not at all concerned with any symbolic ascendancy, right? We have real problems, real crises that we need anyone who's going to be at the helm to deal with. So Obama's, if we can talk about this now, kind of apprehension, ambivalence about, I'm a president of everybody, right? I'm not. It is while he's meeting in 2008 with all the folks on the right. I mean, it's just incredible to me, given the history of this country, given how Obama trades on that history, especially when he's talking to black audiences. His kind of colloquial address, his politics respectability, all of that kind of stuff, right, is directed to a black audience. You guys remember the NAACP thing a couple years ago where he says, stop complaining, you're belly aching. And so for me, I think Baldwin might, by all accounts, look on the Obama two-term presidency with a little bit of fatigue. With nothing really has changed, right? Deportations, drones, Guantanamo has not been closed. And so, yes, we can, if only we would, is what I want to say. And I think Baldwin, when he says never enter this boy's mind, and Baldwin, as I said when Brian Lear, is really concerned with content. He's not at all concerned with symbolism. And I think a lot of us in the last 7 years or so have gotten really seduced by the first black president. So when Baldwin says, I'm not concerned with any Negro first, I mean, that's a real statement, right? About, what are we trying to do here? It's not about symbolism. It's about how do we transform what he says, our common disaster, our common crisis. So I think that's what he was doing in that moment. And now for James Baldwin this time, I think he would have much of the same things to say. The kids we have reading, doing Jimmy and High Noon, they read from The Fire Next Time and all this stuff. And The Fire Next Time resonates with them now. Just frightening for me. It's true. But how, not depressing, but how disappointing that we've come this far, and yet, and still, these 16, 17-year-old kids feel that Baldwin is speaking to and about them. So we haven't come as far as we think. And so I want to say Baldwin would attack what I call the fiction of progress, post-civil rights.
So I think that it is extremely important to say, to absolutely right, that the symbolism of a black president is a powerful one, and yet only a symbol. It in and of itself does not represent a fundamental transformation of our politics, of our social arrangements, of our, of any of the things that represent power in the country on its own. On its own. Having said that, I think it's really important for us to acknowledge what's changed. Because I think it's wrong to say nothing's different than it was in 1963 when James Baldwin wrote his book. So it's what's changed and what hasn't changed, right? It's a both and. So what's changed? So in 1960, first of all, what has changed dramatically in this country is how it looks, right? Because in 1960, 85% of the country was white. And in 2011, 67% of it was white. And in 2050, 47% of the country will be white. Okay? That is in and of itself a significant change that I think one of the things that James Baldwin would be speaking to today,
let's not waste this beautiful information. Should we just pass that mic? Do you have another mic?
I do.
No. Let's have another handheld.
Oh, okay.
So we won the civil rights movement. This is what we have to acknowledge, that our lack of responding effectively to the retrenchment that the fear of loss of white racial identity has created, we are not speaking to. And I think what we miss in not having the voice of James Baldwin today is that honest witness. I think one of his most powerful things he said was, "I'm not a public speaker, I'm a witness." And that's very, very different from what we have today. What we have today is a lot of public speakers.
A lot of talking heads.
A lot of talking heads.
You're not us.
Which we have done. No. Aaron and I both, look.
We are witnesses.
But what I would say is but this is what I would say is it's not because there aren't folks who are witnessing, and I think Karen is one of those folks who are witnessing. But we don't have that really honest, direct witnessing of, wait, we won some big transformative stuff, and then folks started taking it away again. Because that's not the same thing as status quo. We are not in the status quo of 1963 today. But having said that, the mistake, I think, is in thinking that symbolic representation is in and of itself a fundamental structural shift.
I want to clarify. I wasn't saying that things are what they were in 1963. What I'm suggesting is that how power operates is
That's
much
right.
the same. And as Baldwin was witnessing to the operation of power, when people call him a prophet, I think what they forget is his discerning eye about how power operates and how it proceeds uninterrupted, unless you witness. And so my point is, what do we do, given the numbers you just raised, about the fact that the Supreme Court recently did something really drastic, right?
One thing?
I mean, in the last couple of days, you know what I mean? But also, I mean, the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. I mean, we seem to be, I mean, there's the term in the church that Baldwin knows called backsliding. You guys know this term? We're backsliding, it seems to me. So when I say the fiction of progress, I'm talking about the full enfranchisement of the black people. Baldwin said in this film, which is cut together with other pieces of films of things that he does, that black people need witnesses, and I want to say people of color, women, the marginal need witnesses in this hostile world that thinks everything is white or everything is normative, right? And so I think that's what I'm asking, is that we need to witness now. It's called James Baldwin This Time. And the idea that we have come somewhere, but there's an awful lot of work to do, is what I want to say. So I just want to clarify that.
I think what I would add to that is that the way I look at it is I think he would give voice to the idea that we're a post-racial society is a myth. But also, I think he would give voice to sort of the bigger picture of what I think is going on, to what you're talking about. We are about to become a majority-minority country, but we don't have the power that you would expect with being the majority in a majority-minority country. And instead, what we've seen, and you talk about the Supreme Court, you know, John Roberts says, well, lots of black folks showed up to vote, so it must not be a problem, right? And affirmative action, well, that's discrimination against, you know, other races.
You have a black president, so it
That's
can't be
right.
a problem.
And this idea of like, you have a black president, what else do you want? And if you know, conservatives have gone back to this language of makers and takers, right? Of who's deserving and who's not deserving. And so I think what he would give witness to is there is a much larger, what I see is a much larger struggle of the status quo, terrified of those numbers, and doing everything they can, whether it's voting rights, whether it's, you know, affirmative action, you name it, to try to stem the tide. And I think it's aimed at people of color, gay people, women, and they're terrified, you know, of the change that is frankly already happening. And I think he would be somebody who would give witness to that.
And something I would like to bring up at this point is that one way of looking at the history of the United States is that whenever you begin to get a class-based politics, or there starts to be real movement towards some progressive thing, the backlash happens the same way, and it always happens the same way, that a common class of the 60s, let's say, gets broken up on race. They use race to break it up. Fantasies about sex, violence, and so forth are used. And I just want to read you a passage from Nothing Personal. This is Baldwin talking. There's no question that the Supreme Court and so forth are terrified of, but what is the technique they use to make what they want happen? And listen to this in terms of Baldwin talking. By the way, we're having the whole Nothing Personal as a theater event downstairs, but at 8 o'clock, I really urge you to come. It's, of course, the very nature of a myth that those who are its victims and at the same time its perpetrators should, by virtue of those two facts, be rendered unable to examine the myth or even suspect, much less recognize, that it is a myth which controls and blasts their lives. I'm talking about the mystery here of why poor whites, middle-class whites, vote against their own class interests. Continuing. One sees this, it seems to me, in great and grim relief in the situation of the poor white in the Deep South. The poor white was enslaved almost from the instant he arrived on these shores, and he's still enslaved by a brutal and cynical oligarchy. The utility of the poor white was to make slavery both profitable and safe, and therefore the germ of white supremacy which he brought with him from Europe was made hideously to flourish in the American air. 2 world wars and a worldwide depression have failed to reveal to this poor man that he has far more in common with the ex-slaves whom he fears than he has with the masters who oppress them both for profit. And he goes on, and he just says, to be locked in the past, talk about people being locked in the past. To be locked in the past, in effect, means that one has no past, since one can never access it or use it. And if one cannot use the past, one cannot function in the present, and so can never be free. I take this to be, as I say, the American situation in relief, the root of our unadmitted sorrow, and the very key to our crisis. That seems to me to be a description of the Tea Party. The Tea Party seems to me to be the latest manifestation of the great party of white ressentiment that begins with Barry Goldwater, that Richard Nixon brings into being with Richard Nixon in so many words says we have to find a way of being a racist party without using racist language. So you have the war on drugs, you have the law and order, you have welfare queens, and then you get Reagan, who launches his campaign for the presidency in Philadelphia, Mississippi. When people turn out, are you kidding? Don't you know what happened in this town where the 3...
He said states' rights.
He says states' rights, and then when people say to him, how can you do that? He says, what's your problem? These are wonderful people here. You know, and this happens over and over and again, and this, the party, the white racist party, which is the party that's controlling politics in this country, in its different guises at different points. And it's partly Republicans, but it's also, you know, it's basically, that is the strategy that the Supreme Court's going to use. That if we can disenfranchise enough people, if we can, you know, we can get poor whites and even middle-class whites to be so scared of blacks and the problem that, precisely the thing you said, with great excitement that it's going to be 47%, you know, that could be mobilized. And if we can mobilize that 47% and we can get the voter turnout for on the other side, we can keep this going for a very long time.
Nancy, what do you think?
James Baldwin was no friend to power or institutions, and I don't think that made any difference to him, whatever the color or sexual preference or gender identity of the person in charge of them. I sometimes wonder if James Baldwin would have been less anguished about some of the current situations than we are. Remember, he had lived through enough to see quite a lot of crap. And I don't think he ever would have been enchanted with the current president and the way that many people allowed him themselves to be seduced to begin with. I also think that his response to Obama would have been the same as his response to a lot of people caught in difficult institutionalized situations, which is a combination of rage and compassion. And this is how we know that James Baldwin is a genius. His nuance. This is a man who would have had no tolerance for the listicle article, 50 things every 50-year-old woman should know, for Twitter, 140 characters, for intellectuals, all allegedly progressive, having very public, very ugly fights over Facebook. I don't know if James Baldwin would ever feel the same kind of disappointment that one has when one thinks that a certain kind of progress is possible or has been made, to tell you the truth.
Well, Nancy, in 1982, he actually took a tour, not to interrupt you, but in 1982 with Pat Harley and Dick Fontaine, the cities of struggle that he visited back 25 years before. And he said that what has happened from Atlanta to Selma to Newark is an extraordinary make-up job. The Martin Luther King memorials, right? All the ways in which we figure or we lock in the past and we brand the kind of politics you're talking about. So Baldwin, 5 years before he died, was lamenting where we have landed.
Yeah, Baldwin could have out-Foucault'd Foucault. I mean, he understood the way that power recoheres.
Yes, and so what I'm saying is that he would be anguished still, is what I'm saying.
Oh, yes, but I don't think that his would be the anguish of, oh my gosh, I thought all this had changed, oh no, it's not.
No.
I don't think that would be his kind of anguish, Maya.
Well, I think it's really important to recognize, and I am someone who's even written an op-ed saying that Obama did not do what he could have done to have been an eloquent witness to the fact that we were not in a colorblind society despite his ascendancy to the presidency, because nothing was different structurally in terms of how he was able to become president. So the idea that anybody else who's black or Latino or Asian would easily rise to the presidency by virtue of the fact that he had been president is not going to be different. Having said that, though, I actually get really concerned that we over-vilify President Obama. Yeah. And what I mean by that is we create the assumption that by virtue of the fact that he is President of the United States, that he has the same level of room, power, influence that someone who is white would have in the same position at the same time.
Or someone in a politics of 20 or 30
That's
years
right.
ago. There's certain structural ugliness that Obama walks into.
That's exactly my point, and I think this is where we want to bring it back to the Tea Party. Because the construct of, in fact, the Democratic Party, my party, I can say that now. I used to not be able to say that when I ran a C3. My party, it has long refused to fight the Civil War. Because the Southern strategy was actually the seeds of the Tea Party, which is now a national strategy. And it's a national strategy because we never contested this Southern strategy. In fact, in the 80s, 90s, and even early 2000s, we had reams of Democratic pollsters saying, we can win the presidency without the South. Which is essentially to say, we will not wade into the battle about whether we are fundamentally a country still struggling, about whether we are an us across race, or a we that is white that excludes everybody else. We have never been willing politically to actually level that challenge around a region of the country which, by the way, based on demographics, has already gotten to the new majority. And that's what voter disenfranchisement is about, right? And it's a black majority. Despite the fact that the country demographically is becoming majority Latino and Asian in total number, the black population actually is not shrinking, but it's only growing marginally, 11% of the population in 2011, and now about 13% of the population. That doesn't compare to going from less than 1% of the population when you were Asian and to 5% of the population, or 3.5% Latino in 1960 to 17% Latino in 2011, right? So the growth is astronomical, but the South is still black, y'all. It is still black, and it is a majority. And with a very small percentage of white allies would run the South. But we've never invested, even when we had a South Carolinian vice presidential candidate, the Democratic Party did not invest in a South Carolina primary.
Mike, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
I guess I'm struck by the impulse to say the over-vilification of Obama, when I think the folks gathered here are not really concerned with that. I know I am not, right?
No, I know. But there's a rhetoric.
There's a rhetoric.
Particularly on the black left, that I think oversimplifies whether he is the problem versus a set of structural arrangements.
A set of structures for sure, but I guess I want to go back to something about what Nancy said about compassion, right? And so I feel compassion for the structural kind of intractability of Obama's position. I do. And but I also see his effect on young people, right? And what am I saying? I'm saying that, this man had a hard time uttering the word poverty. It's a hard time doing it. And I know too many people who live, the numbers will show that right now, the numbers you're listing here, that people are living in poverty in numbers that should be a national crisis. In the black community, unemployment, all those things are true. So how do we walk on both feet? How do we say these things simultaneously? Because I absolutely see what you're saying, but I want us to be able to hold what's seemingly oppositional things in our head at the same time, and then move on them, act on them. So I'm in response to what you're saying, I'm not at all, I'm not like buoyed by the fact that the numbers are going up. I'm not. Because I think that we have certain intramural dynamics and challenges in the community itself. Black, Latino, all that stuff, where folks are not simply progressive because the numbers have gone up. That the kind of ideological postures, political kind of dispositions or orientations of our communities are exceedingly complex. So I don't see them voting simply as a bloc. More than that, I don't see them expanding our imaginations about how we can all live in this planet in a really fulsome, nourishing kind of way. And that's Baldwin's kind of gospel, right? And so we're not trying to nibble at the edges, is what I'm saying. Baldwin never nibbled at the edges. He was always about transformation. And what Ren just read about our paths is really interesting to me, because I think we have to confront that truly and outside of the kind of banal, electoral politics that we've been confronted with. And how do we do that? Baldwin's voice is missing. And yes, as I've said time and time again, we don't need him right now, but we need someone like that. Because it seems to me that we keep circling and not saying enough truth all the time, the way he did. So I just want to clarify that a little bit.
I don't know if a Baldwin could exist now. I think that we're in a cultural time of self-promotion and self-cannibalization. When every tweet and every appearance, will you get to the next show on MSNBC? Will you be on the, that we are also busy marketing ourselves for understandable reasons, given the economic situation. Baldwin lived as though he had nothing to lose. And no one lives that way anymore. Everybody is aware of what the next step might do to their career. I'll tell you, there's something about being a certain kind of ferocious, brilliant, black gay man born at the time he was that creates a whole different person. I think there's reasons why we don't have Baldwins. And I just want to say that I don't think Baldwin would hold his tongue on the problems with the administration for 1 second, but I also think that he's not just compassion in this sort of pouring Hershey syrup all over everything to make it taste good. I think he really understood the structural limitations of how far people could move. And I think that he would be deeply compassionate about the sort of position that your boss is in, who has also inherited, are we allowed to use
My boss is
jargon
in a
here?
pretty damn good position, I just want to say that.
But he has inherited, as we say technically, a shit show.
But it's a very different structural arrangement than Obama.
Yes.
In New York City,
That's
and with
absolutely
a progressive city council. So that's part of what I mean by the structural arrangement. So you're
Right.
right, and yet he still has more power in some respects at a local level, given his structural dynamic. So I just want to lift that up because I think that one of the things that James Baldwin did so effectively, to the points that have already been raised, is brutally, poignantly, emotionally honest.
Mm-hmm.
And hella smart. I mean, in other words, he told in personal and emotional ways very structural stories.
Right.
And he did that, and he did it in a way that always led us to hope. And I think that's the other difference in the way we talk about these issues now is it's either just a shit, not that you're saying this, but I mean, I think in the larger discourse, it's either all bad, just a shit show, or it's don't attack, they're our leaders, it's all good.
Right.
And there's nothing actually more complex about look at where our incredibly complex, important opportunities are, because we have a whole lot more of them, because we, I think, often acknowledge, despite the fact that it's going to be really tough, really hard, and by the way, not all going to happen in our lifetimes.
Okay.
Right. I was wondering how Baldwin would feel about gay issues these days. So I was thinking, where would he stand on same-sex marriage or don't ask, don't tell? And I was thinking that, so where would he stand on this? Would he say same-sex marriage is just for white people? Absolutely not true. Would he say don't ask, don't tell is unimportant because he was opposed to the military complex? I'm not sure what the answers on those are, but it seems to me that one of the things that he would want, I don't think he'd be impressed by the presidential administration, which has not done any more for queer people than any other Democrat who would have been in office at the time and has never been a profile in courage on these issues. But I do think that he would be more invested in the fact that I can currently get married and enjoy federal benefits in 17 states, but be fired for having a picture of my wife on the desk in 32 of them. I think he would have cared about the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. I think he would have cared about the fact that, anyone living in these 32 states, I think he'd care about the fact that people couldn't make a damn living.
Yeah.
I mean, he would care about the fact, we just screened the new Black Uriah Richard's new film. You guys have seen this? And I led the Q&A afterwards, and I asked...
Describe that a little bit, because some people have it.
The new Black, a film about the failure of Prop 6 about gay marriage in Maryland, right? And they won. And so what was interesting to me was how... You guys might recall that the HRC, back when the Afghanistan war happened, critiqued the language on the...
Human Rights Campaign.
Yes, I'm sorry. I think I'm speaking to really wonderful people who might know what that is.
No, you are, but an acronym is an acronym, my
Just in
friend.
case.
I'll stand
I'm
in for the ones who
sorry.
don't.
I'm
What's
so
that?
sorry.
And you can still be wonderful if you don't.
Yes, exactly. I'm sorry. Oh, God.
I'm going to tell this story really quickly.
Well, let me just finish for 1 second.
Go ahead.
I guess what I'm saying is, and so in that film, and we're going to go back to Baldwin for a second, she's talking about the Black church's homophobia to the campaign for same-sex marriage. And my sense is that Baldwin had he was incredibly, had a moral kind of center, a moral imagination that dwarfs, a lot of people in this world.
Hold the microphone closer.
A lot of people in this world. So for me, I think that for him, he would critique the language on that bomb. Take this, faggots. Right? Not the language, but the actual bomb itself is what I'm trying to say. And likewise, I think he would want much more of a flexible menu for same-sex marriage, right? So that if and this has been said by many scholars, if I want to get married to you, that would be a possibility. But the campaign itself would also include different sets of arrangements where people who are without health care or things like that can be included. So the same-sex marriage was prosecuted, the campaign, as a kind of normative gesture, it seems to me. Valid, I'm a gay man myself, I would like no one to tell me who I can marry, but the sense is that why wasn't it pursued with multi-pronged approaches, right? We talk about the violence against trans people, we keep going about homelessness in LGBT communities. So we talk about marriage, this really problematic institution, that hasn't had a really great success rate, you guys might know, right? And so I'm not against the campaign for gay marriage, but I'm against the lack of fulsomeness around the campaign, the lack of kind of complexity and texture as we prosecute this thing that's really valid, but how do we expand it in a more imaginative, progressive sort of way?
I'm going to come in on this because we're going to have a whole panel about this tomorrow, just to add some other things to the mix. Colin Toibin will be here on Sunday, in one of his articles, says, I know you take exception with this, Rich, but he says that one of the very few things in the prophetic voice that Baldwin got wrong was about prison. But there's this one particular passage at a time when there were 250,000 people in prisons in America, where his line was, they can't, I mean, how many people, they can't put everybody in jail. And
guess what?
I know you point out that that's exactly, and then Kolb says, well, actually they did 10 times that many. And when Baldwin said they can't put that many in jail, I think you were saying to me the other day that the reason he said that was he thought that there would be an uprising if they tried to.
He didn't know, like, he didn't understand what people would do or what they could stand. You know what I'm saying? So the sense is we've been lulled in a kind of political slumber. You know? I mean, it should be the case that all the folks who are locked away in prison is a cause for a kind of, the most recent, as he says, slave rebellion, which he characterized the civil rights movement as. And so what do we do now, right? So, like Occupy was crushed in a systematic effort, right, all across the country. And so where's the progressive voices? And so for me, I'm not disagreeing, it's alarming, but I think he would just say that, who would stand for that? All of our black young boys and girls, more boys and girls, locked away like that. He couldn't imagine that somehow, after all we've done, that we've been bought and paid for, that yet and still, we'll still be here. That's all I meant to say. I'm not disagreeing with it. It's more just, he just imagined something else.
And so how do we account for, let me turn that question back. How is it possible that it was possible to bring that around? And by the way, let's be clear on how it happened. It was Nixon time. It was changing the terms that we weren't going to throw blacks in jail just because we throw blacks in jail. We'll have a war on drugs, which will have there were all these things that were color neutral, supposedly, where you never used actual race things, but it had that effect. And in the case of prison, it's not, and this comes back to all the Michelle Alexander new Jim Crow issues, but we have a country where we continually have these elections that are decided by 100,000 votes either way, or 500,000 votes, in which 5.6 million black males cannot vote. Because they're either in prison or because they have been in prison, they are not allowed to vote. I mean, what kind of insane?
And their population's counted for representation.
And population is counted for
representation. Or they will
representation.
never have any representation.
And they're not given representation. So in fact, many of them in the South, let's say, lead to more,
or New York State,
lead to more Congress people coming from these. And by the way, that's amazing. They are counted in where they're in prison upstate. So you get conservative Republican congressmen from upstate. And they aren't allowed to vote down here, and you end up with these crazy elections. The fact of the matter is, if there was any kind of real democracy in this country right now, none of these issues would be coming along. But how is it that we allow this to happen? And how is it that we can move forward?
I want to read a little section. I was rereading his letter to Angela Davis from 1970. He's just mentioned Nixon, Agnew, Mitchell, and Hoover. And the winning Ronnie Reagan, as he calls him. In the next paragraph, he says, but what in America is the will of the people? And who for the above named are the people? The people, whoever they may be, know as much about the forces which have placed the above named gentlemen in power as they do about the forces responsible for the slaughter in Vietnam. The will of the people in America has always been at the mercy of an ignorance not merely phenomenal, but sacred, and sacredly cultivated. The better to be used by a carnivorous economy which democratically slaughters and victimizes whites and blacks alike. But most white Americans do not dare admit this, though they suspect it, and this fact contains mortal danger for the blacks and tragedy for the nation. I'd be very interested, so when I heard about this panel, I thought about what would it be like if I had breakfast with James Baldwin over the papers or the computer open on the desk. What would he find interesting or outrageous or complex this week? Just yesterday we learned that the U.S. pardon attorney who withheld key information, basically the white dude who's been under Obama as the pardon attorney for 5 years now, has been suppressing information about cases coming up for pardon. And one of the cases he suppressed was a black man named Clarence Aarons, who was a first-time nonviolent drug offender who got 3 consecutive life sentences for introducing a dealer to a buyer and being there at the transaction. And this case was never passed up to Obama by this
And
guy.
got more than the dealer and the...
Oh, yeah. And the prosecutor and the judge in the case both begged that the guy be given clemency. They both realized that what they had done was wrong. You know, and I would love to sit there. So the good news is that there's going to be, he's getting kicked.
He was put there by Bush, right?
Pardon?
He was put there by Bush.
He was put there by Bush and kept there by Obama for 5 years. And this would be the James Baldwin conversation.
Right.
This would be the part where James Baldwin, I think, would have a lot of interesting questions about, on the one hand, so we've been able to spin this number about Obama having the lowest number of pardons of any president since this has been introduced. And on the other hand, now, is this a story about a bad white guy sitting on a low-level, nonviolent black drug offender, or is this a story about presidential irresponsibility? Because I suspect that there were people in the Department of Justice who did not think a lot of Ronald Rogers. But I think that James
This
Baldwin...
is the guy, Ron Rogers, is that person.
Yeah, and I just want to say that I think the good news is that however Rogers really plays into this, that there's going to be new guidelines coming out for commutations and pardons this week, and they may be retroactive. So, Obama does sign the Fair Sentencing Act in 2010 that ends the difference between sentencing over whether you snort your cocaine as powder or whether you smoke it as crack. And he gets rid of the mandatory minimum sentences for crack. So is this a story about Obama really doing what he can without being that black guy, letting other dangerous black guys out? Or is this a story about, yes, so I think that Baldwin would be like the best person on earth to discuss this with over breakfast.
I think a couple of things, just politically speaking. Post-Nixon, we also had a period where Democrats, I'll just say it, as a Democrat, I can say that, were afraid of being considered soft on crime. So how did we get to this place? Because people wanted to be tough on crime. So 3 strikes and you're out. And now here we are looking back and saying, oh shit, that might have not been a good idea, because look what's happened. We have all these people incarcerated. So I think part of it is, in terms of the political system, one party kind of was too concerned about what the other side was saying and not able to stand up for its own values. And I think that would be something that Baldwin would challenge us on.
But that's the tragedy of liberalism for the last 60 years since McCarthyism.
But this also comes full circle back to because I'm not going to lose this point.
She and I have been doing this for
about 30 years, literally. So if you look at this criminal justice point, and we've already talked about disenfranchisement, it is absolutely true. If you look at the perfection of the Southern strategy, how many of us remember Lee Atwater?
Yeah.
Okay, now first, let's start with Willie Horton. Okay, so Willie Horton, Dukakis running for president against Bush Sr. His Democratic challenger, Al Gore, first raises Willie Horton. Okay, and we all forget this. Al Gore used Willie Horton first in the primary. Yeah, we all forget this, except some blacks in the Congressional Black Caucus who constantly remind folks behind closed doors in the Democratic caucus meetings. Nobody reminds us publicly, but it is true. So one of the things that when I said that we have to acknowledge that white Democrats have been willing to ignore race or use racial wedges themselves, to a lesser extent, but themselves. That's something we would have borne witness to if we had had a James Baldwin. But I think secondly, then Lee Atwater then picks it up as the political strategist for Bush the Senior. Willie Horton was a black man out on a furlough program from prison who then rapes and kills a white woman. Damn. I hate it when black men do that.
When anyone does.
That was a joke. So my point is, but when Lee Atwater, has, his brain tumor or brain cancer, I can't remember what it was, but he's literally dying. He gets interviewed by a political scientist.
He has a karma tumor.
And he tells the truth.
Okay,
he tells the truth. And what he says is, you start in 1968 saying, nigger, nigger, nigger.
And then,
Now you say.
Then it starts backfiring on you. Can't say it anymore. So then you say school busing and crime. And then now, fast forward, it has gotten so abstract that all you have to say is taxes.
Really interesting.
Okay, I mean, he just laid it out. It's like 3 sentences long, and he just, in 3 sentences, lays out. But now, back to this point, the Democratic, not just the Democratic Party, because it's actually the left, even the progressive left, refuses then to talk about taxes, except sometimes on certain things, or is afraid to. But I think, so one of the things we have to say when we come to these criminal justice issues is they have been so radically racialized as part of that strategy that our side has had a difficult time confronting its own issues around racialized fear. And the thing that Baldwin would have done today is, and I just want to share 2 quotes that he made because I think it's just as relevant today as ever on this criminal justice issue. So he said, that's not it. He said, the innocent country set you down in a ghetto in which, in fact, it intended that you should perish. That is the relationship between the war on drugs, the over-policing of certain communities that are black and Latino, and by the way, Native American, where Native Americans are the biggest populations of color in a place like South Dakota. Criminalize them, but you can criminalize them by geography. And then never quite be able to get to what Baldwin would have called us to, which is figuring out how are we going to work out an identity for this country that recognizes how racialized that identity is, how fear-driven it is, and to confront and develop a different identity collectively.
Can I, there's something I want to show in a second, but this will complexify it a little bit more. We were talking with Harry Belafonte last week. Bill T did a wonderful interview with him. And there's a section that I want to play which makes it a little bit more complicated. This is Harry Belafonte talking about Baldwin and about unintended consequences.
Political compromise doesn't always mean social victory.
Yes.
Sometimes political compromise can bury you. There'll be a lot of people that tell you that in getting segregation officially off the books of legal experience changed a lot that happened for black people. I was in many ways richer under the rules of segregation in my community because segregation confined me to certain experiences that nourished me, that were not there for me once that moment was liberated. I knew all the black leaders, all the black role models, because I knew them in my community. Once the oppressive laws that kept us in that confinement were removed, all that wonderful intellectual expression went off to Rochester, went off to New Rochelle, went off to Beverly Hills, went off to suburban America. They integrated with what white elite people do. And certain heroes and heroines were not known to me because they no longer lived in our community. What we had to look for was what were we losing by becoming integrationists. We lost a certain familiarity. When I look at a lot of young people today, they say, oh man, in the neighborhood I grew up in, same one, I didn't know nobody. There was nobody there for me to look at. They didn't go to church on Sunday and see Paul Robeson. They didn't go to church on Sunday and see W.B. Du Bois. We left the community to become senators and congressmen and to live in the mansions of power because we became governors and we became caught in the bigger system. And getting caught in that bigger system means, in fact, that the same people that led us in the rebellion against oppression were now the guys manipulating the new design for where we were to go.
This is really important, I think. I mean, what he's talking about is what I mentioned before, is the intramural, right? Intramural meaning the kind of the space among us. And Harold Cruz wrote a book you guys might know in 1967 or 69 called The Negro Intellectual, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. And Hortense Spielers wrote something in 1994 called the same thing, she called it a post-date. And they're both very Baldwin-esque by saying that, it's not about you. You know what I mean? It's not about you, the talking head, you with your houses, as Mr. Belafonte says. It's about, again, transformation. So I think what he's suggesting there is not that he wants to roll the clock back. He's lamenting something about where we found ourselves, right? And that he's not being nourished. But more than that, that there's something split in the community. We're not all on the same page. And it's a fiction to say that folks are on the same page back in the Civil Rights Movement. You know, folks are embracing it now. But back then, you know, you weren't allowed to be on the street if you were in college. I mean, so it's a fiction that recirculates now and the victory already won. And I'm saying that struggle continues. And I think that's what he's suggesting too. Again, not rolling back. He's simply talking about the limits of integration and the work that we have to do intramurally to correct them.
So I grew up in a very, I shouldn't say I grew up, but I spent the first 9 years in a black, poor neighborhood in D.C. It was called DuPont Circle.
Oh my God.
I'm not lying, y'all. Okay. And I went to the neighborhood inner city public school, which is Adams, which is now, it's really hard to get in if you're a person of color now to Adams, because the neighborhood is so gentrified. But I say that because I went to the school, I was one of the only kids that wasn't on welfare, and nobody was really having a very nourished experience. And so I think there's a generational thing that happens because we still got tons of racial segregation. In fact, by some measures, we're more segregated today than we were in 1950, thanks to a lot of housing policies that created white suburbs that also reconcentrated segregated communities in urban areas. And now we're resegregating urban areas and pushing folks of color out to suburbs, but still segregated. So, you know, and I know you're not, and I say this because I think one of the things that's changed radically, because I was just born in 1964, so, you know, a year after Baldwin wrote this piece, is that we have so radically reoriented, including for whites, because those white suburbs is also what de-ethnicized white people. Mm-hmm. Because before the suburbanization in the mid-century, 20th century, whites weren't white, y'all weren't white. You were German American, and you were Italian American, and you were Lithuanian, right? And you lived in ghettos that were ethnically identified. In fact, at the turn of the century, half of those groups weren't even considered white.
That's right.
And we're in black codes in the South.
The Irish were black.
The Irish were black. The
Jews
Italians were black. Slavs were not white. So the process of creating white segregated suburbs and pulling white folks out of cities and concentrating black Latino ghettos was actually to create the melting pot, white melting pots, where white identity became something that transcended ethnic identity. And so I say that because it comes back to how we make decisions about housing, about education, about where we live, about what our political geography is. All of that actually starts to drive psychological identity. And the thing that Baldwin, I think, did so well that we don't have enough of now is actually articulating that. Articulating the way we structure society. We actually make decisions that start to drive like the psychic dissonance that we have about who we are and what is a we, and then even starts to ignore the fact that this is something that, to the compassion point, it's much easier to be compassionate towards people who are white, who are fearful of people of color, when we understand how much the structures have produced their fear. Which doesn't excuse it, but also enable, but that was his challenge, right? His challenge was how you love and have compassion in the face of saying, and not always forgiven.
Yeah, no, that's his brilliance, absolutely. And, you know, when I say his compassion, you know, his was not a soft or smudgy compassion at all. He's so fascinated by the concept of brutality, right, in his protest novel essay, you know, and something that he realizes without being mushy about it is the way in which the the way in which white people are dehumanized by their terror, without ever letting go of the fact that obviously someone is getting the shit end of the stick. You know, and that is a nuance that I have heard almost no one bring to contemporary politics. In fact, I think particularly, you know, this new concept that I'm going to get mine, you know, driven by reality TV, driven by the huge and very real income gap. You know, there is an inequality crisis in this city and throughout the country, but that, you know, I think that it's producing a sort of hostility and aggression, plus the kind of self-aggrandizement of Twitter and Facebook, where everybody can be a star, and where you get more attention, you know, if you're bigger, louder, meaner, uglier, can drive an angrier mob. You know, this makes me, I admire James Baldwin more now than ever for his ability to hold these complexities.
I feel like it brings us back to this idea of the symbolic versus the structural, because all the structural things that you're talking about are the kinds of things that, you know, as Harry was just saying, if you went off to go to Congress, right, you're not just trying to, you know, you're sort of rolling a rock up a hill, because it's not just your little piece, it's this much larger structural issues that I think we don't talk about, we don't acknowledge, and the most important of those, frankly, is, you know, let's be really honest, we don't talk about race. There's too much fear in having that conversation, and I think that's why a Baldwin, a voice that would say, time out, you know, white folks are afraid of the fact that we have a black president and what that may represent. I mean, let's just say that, right? For some people, that's true. The president himself even said that. But, you know, what ends up happening, and this goes to sort of the MSNBC, Fox News, CNN TV culture, if you say, Eric Holder says, look at how they treated me, right? Or forget about me, Attorney General of the United States of America at the National Action Network. Well, what happens? Oh, he's race baiting. Mm-hmm. Why are you bringing race into this?
Well,
right.
But
I just would say, and I think but that's the problem. I think part of it is liberals have been for too long afraid to push back and don't know how to push back. And frankly, I think that's part of why we got to where we are, because we didn't push back early enough. That's right. And we didn't start, we did. And I think with Obama, frankly, I'm happy to see some of the things that he's able to do freed up in a second term. I wish he would have been doing some of it in the first term, but I get that, he was walking a very fine line. Doesn't make me happy with everything he did, right. But it is, the reality when, if in a first term he would have done what he just did on sentencing reform, right, or what he did around school discipline reform, right, they would have, they were like, well, he's going to paint the White House black, right? I mean, that would have, and he would, I'm serious. And in terms of the fear factor, right?
They did anyway.
But in terms of the fear factor, it's out there, but we don't have a public discourse acknowledging it.
Can I ask you a question, and I don't mean to have you be MSNBC in the room, but what the hell, let's have you be that. To the extent that we talk about the fact that in Baldwinian terms, the great challenge is to reach white people and have them understand that, that the Koch brothers and so forth are manipulating them in all those sorts of ways. MSNBC is not doing that. I mean, it seems. I mean, that the problem being that MSNBC is preaching the converted, and those people who you want to reach are watching Fox News, and the communication culture is broken out that way. Or I'm just curious in terms of when you are people who vote Tea Party, do any of them watch MSNBC, except in the mode of, I hate them, I hate them.
Yeah, right. Sometimes they do so they can then tweet at you and attack you after the fact.
But is there some way, is MSNBC ever going to do it? And this is another way of getting at the problem of a Baldwin. What show would he have gone on? I mean,
Melissa Harris-Barrett.
Yeah. Or Rachel, maybe.
But the point.
Probably mine.
But the point is, how do you get people who should be watching Rachel? I don't need to watch Rachel.
But that is part of the conundrum of cable television, right? Because part of the problem, with Fox is you have the Tea Party types and the conservative types, and you have moderates who watch because they want to see what the other side is saying. And with MSNBC, or like even CNN, which has acknowledged that their audience is actually more liberal than they realize, you don't have that kind of audience. And so, unfortunately, we do end up preaching to the converted. And although I would offer that in some ways, I think what's important about that is it is important to have voices out there saying some of these things, because it's
Yeah.
not getting said in other
No,
places.
I agree with you, but I'm asking, so I completely agree with, energizing the base, all that kind of stuff I think is very important. But having said that, how do we solve this problem?
So I think one of the things we have to do, and as someone who's been, I'm really grateful for MSNBC, because if you didn't have an MSNBC, there would be no big megaphone countering the fiction, the politicized fiction of Fox News, right? So I think it's really important to say it matters a lot. I am struck by, when I've appeared, how I will get an email or a text from somebody white in central Georgia that says, or I'm walking through the airport and somebody white in Michigan will stop me and say, oh, thank God, because I'm by myself where I live. And the only way I can make it and also think about things I can do to challenge is by the fact that I've got MSNBC, because I don't have a community of people around me where I geographically am. So I don't think we should underestimate that. But I think the second point is I don't think we should overestimate the Tea Party. It kind of drives me crazy in the sense that, I don't mean because it actually, I do believe, this is what I mean, I think the Tea Party's been very strategic and effective, and it's relatively small.
Bigger than the Tea Party, though. I think going back to what we were talking about before, I think the conservative movement has really cannibalized our morals and our values. If we're having a conversation, most of the reporting on what the Supreme Court did the other day was not about, affirmative action was a core American value, right? That we're supposed to protect the rights of the minority. Instead, it was, thank God we got rid of those racist policies, right? That's how it was reported, even in mainstream news. And so I think part of what's happened is they have, and this is again why I think a voice like a James Baldwin would be so important to stop that before it happens.
Well, but a little bit here. Affirmative action is always deeply contested in this country.
Always.
It's always. So, I think while we've lost because of a lot of ground because we have lost control of representation on the Supreme Court, it's affirmative action has always been one of our hardest issues.
Just in terms of national mainstream media, framing it in the context of racist policies,
I actually think you can go back and find examples of that in 72 and in 75.
Sure, but not in our modern context.
No, but I think this is because the larger frame of colorblind society is the problem, because you can't have affirmative action in a colorblind society. So in other words, if you have a dominant frame of colorblindness and we are now colorblind, the affirmative remedy makes no sense.
Really
So I don't think you can separate the fact that our mainstream discourse, even from a center place or even a center left place, endorses that, because goes back to that larger point of we haven't effectively challenged the myth of colorblindness, because affirmative action was hard even when people recognized race was an issue, and now when people don't recognize it, it's a very hard sell. So
that's another part of what we bought into.
Right. But I guess what I'm saying is, rather than I'm agreeing with the larger point. I'm saying that's the real nugget for affirmative action is that we have not effectively contested colorblindness. Yeah. So I agree with that point, but it's hard to pull affirmative action out from that.
But I would say that to go even a step further and say the thing that we continually fail to contest is, don't you see how they're using this to divide us? Do you understand, America, that we have no estate tax anymore? Do you understand that they've been doing it?
But look at the fact that you have, some 19 states where you have Republican governors and legislatures denying millions of Americans health care through the Medicaid expansion money. And finally, people are starting to get it that, oh, wait a second, maybe that is a bad thing, right? And there are starting to be stories of people who are actually suffering. But point being, that's what I mean by in terms of co-opting, that, their hatred of, this change is so strong. They're denying millions of people access to health care. And it's more than that, but that to me is one of the more simple examples.
And I think one of the things that Baldwin would have been able to do that I think is a real opportunity moment is to understand and explain and help people see why Trayvon Martin is dead. And what I mean by that is this, and I'm not speaking about whether George Zimmerman himself embodied this, but the fact that that story that is so resonant with so many people of color in this country, and people who are white who understand that experience, that it is dangerous to walk down the street when you're black, no matter who you are and what you're doing, or your age. That story is a story about how deeply embedded our racialized fear is, and how blind we are to its existence at the same time. And the discussion of that, the discussion of the science of implicit bias is really deep and large now and 20 years old, and of stereotype threat, and of all, I'm using the wonk terms, but it's deeply demonstrated, and it challenges colorblindness, because colorblindness relies on this myth that as long as we have rights, race has now been dealt with, rather than as long as we have a psychology that we are not even necessarily always conscious of how we are othering people, and how that actually endangers their lives or prevents them from getting a job because of their name on a resume, despite their qualifications, or making crack cocaine seem worse than powder cocaine. That all those things we do not actually confront as a society, and I know all these academics, I have myself tried to find the lay terms of explaining some deep, complex. James Baldwin could have done it.
I mean, what he would have said is human value, right? I mean, like a lack of value for black lives. He would have said it really straightforwardly. But he would also say that not only black lives here, he said human life and energy, right? So he would talk about Palestine, about, Obama's drone campaign. He would ask the question, what are we doing here? And so I guess back to the point about where would he appear. And MHP is one very good place to appear, but I think his critiques would not be contained, right? So the Trayvon Martin conversation is, we can all get on board in that, but how many at MSNBC can talk really candidly about ALEC or Israel or settlements, which Baldwin always did. So for him it was local and global. His moral imagination wasn't simply about this local place. And so I guess my interest, my courting, my invitation for us to walk on both feet is what we need to be doing. That's why we're in a political somewhere now, because we're all about self-aggrandizement, but also about just the next little thing right there. We're very presentist, right? And we're also very reactionary. So we're just very concerned on Twitter, on Facebook with slight. So have Stephen Colbert say something, and then black Twitter goes crazy, or Asian Twitter, whatever it is in that scene. But you get what I'm saying? There's no sense of how do we imagine for ourselves what we'd like to say. Instead, we're in direct defensive response. Yet and still, I keep saying that, but yet and still, we're back in our heels.
Well, that's because context actually takes time. I think James Baldwin would get shut down on any TV. The guy has no soundbite, right? He speaks in full paragraphs. And that this is, I think he would have been.
Notice that was him talking with William Buckley.
Yes, yes, and that I think he would also be quick to talk about what capitalism has to do with what the New York Times runs.
Private neoliberalism and all that kind of stuff.
With its reliance on page views, with the left's perpetual conviction that what we need to do is bend over backwards as though those people from Fox will ever watch us. Fox is Fox because Fox is unapologetic, and that is why poor whites vote against their interests, because we are wussies. That is why gay men who were Republicans for so long didn't come out or identify as gay men, because we are wussies. No one wants to be on this side.
Rand, we need to save some time for questions, guys. So can we?
So here we are, the wussies. Go ahead, hit us. Bring it on.
Did I scare Maya Wiley?
No, I'm just signing up.
I was like, yeah. Like, when are we going to get some, right?
I'm not a wussy.
So, okay, now we have to give one of these back so it can go around, and you guys have to share that one.
Hello. I wanted to share a couple thoughts and read a quick passage by Baldwin and then kind of get you guys' reactions and thoughts to that. I think, first of all, one factor that wasn't really mentioned at all was my generation, the younger generation, and the influence that has more than any specific racial demographic.
How old are you?
18. It's a combination of all of them, and I think there's both a lot of positives and negatives to being in my generation. I think some of the positives are the fact that it's so easy to connect thanks to Facebook and Twitter and all of this, and that we have access to all of this information. The downside is that it's an overload of information, so we've gained information and lost knowledge. I think one of my biggest questions about our generation today is it seems like when I bring up a lot of these issues, things that have been talked about, and other things too, to people my age, the biggest, and not even people my age, just people in general, the biggest response I get is, well, that's just the way it is. Things get worse, and things change and get worse, and then we don't say, well, that's just the way it is, why do we have to make it worse? We say, oh, it's already bad, well, that's just the way it is. We don't, so is that apathy or hopelessness? And that's my first question.
Can I just answer one thing to your first question, and then you ask the next question? An important thing to understand, and David Graeber is very good on this, neoliberalism, which includes, by the way, Clinton and Kingsley and all those people, was never an economic doctrine. It was always a political doctrine, and the political doctrine was tough shit. In its entirety. Tough luck, that's just how it's going to be. There are no alternatives. That was always the neoliberal, and that's Tony Blair, and it's Clinton, and it's Clinton's coming into Obama, and so forth. So it's important to understand that neoliberalism never made an argument. It just said you don't have any choice. Tough luck, and that is everywhere. Go ahead.
The other thing, it was mentioned a lot, speaking about James Baldwin as the honest witness of our time, of his time, and I think, again, going back to the point of that's just the way it is, I don't necessarily think that's enough. I think there's something he had that's a fire in his words, where what he said got through, and people acted and thought, whereas people are too afraid. And again, going back to the younger generation today, if you look back at almost every major protest or movement in this country, was largely done by the youth, by the college students, honestly. And at this point, you see that they're almost immobilized. They don't do anything. They might tweet about it or talk about it or say something. And again, this is my next point, words are losing meaning. Especially due to something like Twitter and Facebook, where you can post whatever you want, say whatever you want, and there are no repercussions, no real repercussions. So now we create this campaign on cyberbullying. Yes, I think bullying and cyberbullying are an issue, but it's also just a futile attempt to attack a problem that exists in the lack of human connection in the world of media and internet.
There's also the illusion that when you tweet, you've done something.
Yes, exactly. Oh, like this status on Facebook, and it'll save someone in Africa. No,
right.
it doesn't mean anything.
Right.
And I see those things all the time. But then it's gotten to the point where, I'll stay off of that topic. I think in terms of the political system, and it was touched on. You were talking about the idea that that James Baldwin spoke as if he had nothing to lose.
That's right.
And it seems that today no one lives that way. And I think that's because we live, one, in a country run on fear, and second of all, that in the political system, and actually in all systems, people are much more concerned about personal gain and maintaining their image and reputation than they are with representing the people they're elected to represent. Almost no one does, because the rude positions that people have to take, people aren't willing to take, because the word of the people means less than their position in
Well,
that
remember, people are also
political party.
spending so much time trying to raise the money to campaign again,
Mhm.
and are so beholden to special interests. You know, the McCutcheon decision that we just had, and Citizens United before that, it means that politicians are less and less free to do anything but bend over backwards for the people who will make or break them. So these are systemic issues as well as personal moral issues.
I want to just speak to your first question first, because Baldwin said in Karen's film very poignantly, he was asked by this austere British interviewer, "So James Baldwin, are you in despair about the world?" And he goes, "Oh, no, I'm not in despair. You can't tell the children there's no hope. You can't tell the children." And it comes up all the time. So he said, "I'm enraged by the world," right. That fire in the gut that you're talking about. But it was not apathy, right? It was nothing like that at all. And so you might find that here now. But I think he also said, like, you can't do anything else to me. By the time I was 17 years old, right? You've done what you could. It's a different generation, right? But I think there are a lot of people now, from just certain practices, where folks are hopeless, where they're just, on my street in gentrifying Washington Heights, I saw three, and pardon me for 1 second, three boys, two boys, one with a machete in the middle of my block at 6 o'clock in the morning. I've lived there for 14 years. I've never seen, it's by the river, you know what I mean? It's expensive, at least for me. And they were walking down the street with a cutlass like it was Ogun. You know what I mean? Coming down the street. And so that for me, I mean, it takes someone's head off. And so there's something about what has happened to our children on our watch. That's why they say what they say, right? And the Baldwin would always say, they were the first concern. You know? So I think if we get back to that, we're in a good place. But beyond that, I think I do this in my classes pedagogically about how to interrupt that, it's very dystopic. And then by 15 weeks, they're like, you know, yay, we can do it. You know what I mean? So I think we can't get stuck there. We can't get stuck there.
I also think we have to, so you were, I just really want to thank you for that. We have more information and less knowledge, because I think that's really poignant. I also think that, you know, we have to remember that James Baldwin, particularly when we're talking about The Fire Next Time, was in movement times, and movement by definition is decentralized, it's catalytic. It's when Martin Luther King and a whole host of leaders put together the Montgomery bus boycott, nobody knew if it would be successful, right? Nobody knew what it would produce. And by the way, they couldn't replicate it. As successful as it was, it could not be replicated. King was in despair, and it wasn't until 4 young black men in North Carolina went and sat down in a lunch counter, and nobody told them to do it. And it was only 4 of them. It was only 4 of them. It was catalytic. And so I think what we should remember, and I think this is really, because your generation is and this is a kind of a dystopic hope maybe, but that we are in a paradigm shift. We're in a period of paradigm shift. And in a period of paradigm shift, significant dislocation also creates the opportunity for that kind of catalytic movement. So that what we hear is expression of apathy, I think is expression of searching. And it only takes the 4 kids that go and show up at the lunch counter. It doesn't take, you know, and so I think we get overly concerned with whether we see that we can quantify a certain percentage of a demographic that is active and engaged, rather than seeing whether we see the percolating bubbles of hope and action that may be decentralized, maybe not totally thought through, that we, you know, and that actually lead to other things.
Repeat that again, because that's what you always, crisis and opportunity.
Yeah, it's well, I can't repeat it, but you can do that.
You mind?
Wait.
Nadim.
He wants to read. I just want to hear what.
No, but I think this is important that we dig down deeper into this, because this is young speaking to old, and because, you know, it happens quickly.
Wait, you just called me old.
Well, I'm speaking for myself. This is the demographic, oftentimes, of people who are dancers. Yeah. What did you think yesterday? Did you see Nothing Personal last night?
Yes.
Now, and Ren, you have the book there. What did James Baldwin say?
Which part?
The children have lost respect for their parents, and the parents have lost respect for their children. First of all, what does this mean to the room? And then he begins this thing about, if you do not show a child a boundary, he will spend the rest of his life in pursuit of, and I begin to lose it. Does that mean anything to you? Because it sounds like it becomes the guilt of poor parenting that your generation is lost because we were lost.
I think I really like that line about the parents and the children, how the parents...
Did you understand it? Am I right in what he says?
Yeah, the children have lost respect.
What does it mean to lose respect for your children?
I think it's in the sense, well, I don't necessarily think it's a new thing. I think it's just a factor of human existence. We tend to look at the young as naive and not really worth listening to until a certain age when something changes.
You've been contributing to political campaigns.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, when they can take your money.
When you vote and when you have money.
And then, in terms of the children losing respect for their parents, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Joe Rogan, surprisingly. He said something about how You know, when you're young, you have this idea that there are real things as adults. And then as you start to get older, you realize that everyone is just as lost as everyone else, and we're all just kind of scrambling through the dark. And that's something Baldwin has also touched on. And I think that is kind of becoming, with the crisis of the country today, is becoming more and more apparent to young people earlier on.
What would it take for me? What would it take for me for you to respect me? There used to be a time you respect me because I've been alive and I know stuff. That has not changed. I think that there's something more right now, and it sounds very conservative what I'm trying to say, that I think that we no longer have the principles of generation.
Well, all right. On a personal note, I'd like to say I do have respect for you. One, for setting this up, and I also do think that there's wisdom in everyone's words, and no matter how much I think I may or may not know, people that have lived longer than me and gone through other things than I have something to teach me in and of itself.
So you would not try an adult in your life on principle, when that adult speaks, that you do not match them word for word. Some people are assholes and they do not know. And I'm speaking to your generation right now. You're 18, and you're a very thoughtful 18-year-old. But I come from, when my mother died, there were 200 nieces and nephews, 200. So I know a bit about this. What does it mean to say, I don't agree with you, but you are the older person here, and I'm going to listen. Now that's a responsibility on us. And I think that we have, one of the things that Baldwin meant by the boundaries was, how do you teach people, I know you don't understand this, but this is good for you because someday you're going to be where I am.
But Bill, how do we make that a two-way street? We don't listen to our children, right?
Yes.
So you're right to say what you're saying. I think that's true. People are less respectful. But what Mr. Belafonte was talking was a different time where it was a two-way street. So are we listening to our children? I mean, are they allowed to speak at 3 years old?
I'm an old-fashioned Southern black man.
Okay.
That was not part of the job description.
It wasn't. And so how do we move? So it wasn't, and that's why I'm asking it. So you say it sounded conservative. So I'm wondering, how do we get to a place, I think Nadeem is saying this, where it's a kind of in a mutual respect?
Mutual? I don't think we're doing mutual.
I think what it has to be.
You are their guardians.
You
are their guardians. They are not my colleagues.
No, we're not. It's a complex symmetry is what I'm saying. It's a complex
Okay, that's a little bit more fancy way of saying it.
It's not peer-like. But what I'm saying is that there are tragedies, right? So how do we invest them with, as Baldwin said, with a morale that they can do whatever they want to be?
First thing you teach is sometimes you have to be quiet, and I am going to show you how to walk the walk, and I am going to stand by, I'm going to be consistent, I'm going to be firm, and I'm going to be loving. I am going to earn your respect because of consistency and the firmness and the lovingness of my position. You're going to have to, how did you say that, the neoliberalism? That's the way it is. Then someday you're going to be in this position.
You don't want to be a neoliberal.
Okay, well, I'm saying.
So how would you respond, Bill? I'm not to interrupt you. How would you respond to Toni Morrison, who said when she was coming home from Random House that when she was tired, she'd walk in the room and she wanted to say, pick that up, fix your hair. All the things my mom said to me, from the Caribbean, talk about strict. And she said, all they want is your best. So are you smiling? Are you listening to them? And so she was asking herself, how do I better parent? And it's a real question. I hear what you're saying.
Actually, I'm asking the same thing, and I'm making sure the parents in the room should jump in here.
Wait.
Well, I have a parent.
Yeah.
And and my kids are in public school. I mean, not 18, but 13 and 10. And one of the things that strikes me is how significantly different the childhood experience is today than when I was a child. So I have boundaries growing up, and I give boundaries to my children. But what my children are confronting every day is so much more stressful, is so much more constrained. Their behavior, their thinking, what their day-to-day lives are like are so significantly more constrained. The high-stakes testing,
the lack of time to daydream,
the over-programming, the stress. The level of stress. I actually think my 13-year-old experiences virtually the same level of stress on a day-to-day basis that I, as an attorney that is on a senior cabinet for the mayor of the New York City, experiences. And I'm not exaggerating. I mean, it is, and as a public school student, in a privileged household. So imagine the range of it is a fundamentally different, and I think a fundamentally broken construct that we've created.
So that means that you are more mutual with your child?
Well, what I say is I think we end up having these conversations where my kids say, I'm so stressed out. Those words never came out of my mouth at their age. Never. And I
You were
say,
a stressor or not a stressee?
Yeah, exactly. And I aspired to that. But and I was good at my job.
She was really good at her job.
But my point is that, so then this is the conversation I'm having with a 10 and a 13-year-old, and I've been having for years is, you are stressed out, and so am I. And I need this from you, Mom. And I was like, I need to give it to you, and here's my stress. And we're having almost an adult level conversation about stress.
I want to get back. I definitely want you had something you want to read from Baldwin too, so I'll get to that.
Yeah. Well, one last thing I wanted to say in response to you, Bill. I completely do agree with the idea that my generation's parents are much too easy on the kids in the sense of not teaching any discipline and respect.
And very guilty.
And I think, but at the same time, I do think everything is a matter of balance. I think, so I don't agree with the idea that basically you have to stay quiet and listen to what I say, and then once you reach the age, then you can do the same, because all we're doing then is postponing adulthood and thinking. But I do think that we, because at that point, if you tell the kid shut up and sit down, then they lose their voice, and they may never regain it.
But I would never say shut up and sit down.
Yeah.
There comes a moment where you do not match me word for word.
Oh yeah, well I think that needs to be understood in the beginning of the conversation.
Black people, I'm speaking to you. You're Jewish and Egyptian, yeah. Right? But I have seen it now. I was at Woodstock at 17. We raised, I say we, my brothers and sisters. I think I am the uncle to 54 people.
Wow.
Right? San Francisco was a disaster to be raising children in the 70s. I know of one young man who was in a building in the Haight. His parents, whatever their problems were making a living, he is going up and down this building, and people are having orgies upstairs with cocaine. He had his first hit of cocaine at age 10. Okay? Now, fast forward 40 years. The parents had their problems. They are my relatives. I think that was shitty parenting. Unfortunately, they had to live in a building that they lived in, and unfortunately it was the 70s, and everybody was still living the revolution, quote, sexual and what have you, of the 60s. Now this sounds like mea culpa, but quite frankly, I'm looking now at what it would have meant for them to have been able to watch a little bit more carefully and say no. And say no.
That I agree with.
Bill is talking about responsibility and love, not just discipline. I'm not sure if you heard the other side of the street that he was talking about. It's not just to shut up and don't match me word for word. It's that my responsibility as an adult is to be mature, sober, responsible, as consistent as I can be.
There's out of love and concern.
There's an exchange there that he's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
What was the passage you were going to read?
From my favorite essay, The Artist's Struggle for Integrity, I think, first of all, I want to say really quick, I think Baldwin would be concerned today with much more than racism and sexuality. I think they're still incredibly important issues, but I think he would also recognize, as Harry Belafonte mentioned, that there are bigger systems at play that are causing much more issues, and it's just in the sense that we need to attack the root rather than the branches, and all these things that are very real issues, and all the things we hear about on the news are important, but they are branches of the. We talk about they, whoever the they is, whether it's the Koch brothers or the Republican Party, whoever we choose to demonize in that moment, they are against everyone having healthcare. They are against welfare. They are against gay rights, but we never look at the they. We only look at what they do. We just say they are like there's someone is against this. We don't investigate why those someone have all the power. So that
a lot of us journalists do. Yes, we do. Oh, we sure as heck do. It's a question of whether we ever get the page views
that
the article about Angelina Jolie gets.
Yes.
And really, all love to Angelina Jolie.
Can we have more people?
Yeah. And so this paragraph says, The time has come, it seems to me, to recognize that the framework in which we operate weighs on us too heavily to be borne and is about to kill us. It is time to ask very hard questions and to take very rude positions, and no matter at what price. It is time, for one example, to recognize that the major effort of our country until today, and I'm talking about Washington all the way down to whoever heads the Women's Christian Temperance Union, is not to change a situation, but to seem to have done it. It is spectacular, for example, to have been forced ultimately to bring in the entire whatever it was, militia, U.S. Marshals, to get James Meredith into school. And from a certain point of view, which I do not at all share, I can see that one could say that no other country would have done it. It's escaped everybody's notice that no other country would have had to. It is easy to admire the sit-in students in the South, and nothing is more delightful than to talk to Martin Luther King, whom I admire very much. But it is too easy to admire a Christian minister, especially if you take no responsibility for what's happening to him or those people that he tries to represent. And this line right here is the most important to me. It is hard to begin to understand that the drift in American life towards chaos is masked by all these smiling faces and all these do-good efforts. Aside from the contextual parts, I think this is more applicable today than it was then.
Thank you. Some other comments?
For the sake of time,
Yeah, sorry.
I think we have to maybe
let's
take
go.
two more.
Two more.
And then we can reconvene in the lobby. Okay.
Over there. Yeah. We'll take you and then we'll take you. Okay.
Thank you. This is in part a response to Mr. Jones and about the younger generation and children. When Muhammad Ali was speaking at a university, he was asked to come up with a poem. That poem is on the wall of the Studio Museum in the lobby. His poem was, "You, me, we." Now, James Baldwin talked a lot about we. And in one of the sessions yesterday, it was a traveling we, in which he included himself, which was sometimes a white we, sometimes a black we, sometimes a global we. When we're talking about what children are supposed to do and what adults are supposed to do, it's not a we. It's a me and you. And the answer is not in what you're supposed to do and what I'm supposed to do, but what we can do together. And in that regard, with regard to the we, I'm wondering what your feelings may be about the charter school movement and what that does.
I hear your mother call.
And what that does to the communal we. What that does to the communal we.
Oh, yes, the next question will answer that.
Let's take one more question. We'll answer both together. So just her right there.
Yes, I'd like to address this as an educator.
The mic is coming to you.
And then,
I don't need a microphone.
yeah, but we need.
Okay. I started teaching on the Lower East Side in the 1970s. And there is a major, tragic problem with the child of this century. I love children. I'm a grandmother, I'm a mother, and I've seen what has happened. New York City schools were more segregated in the 90s than in Mississippi. And Mayor DeBlasio, who is in a very unique position with his politics, his mind, and it's New York City, it's not national. I was very disheartened when he withdrew the co-location of Eva Moskowitz, who does not care about any child in this city except her own. And it's profit-based. But because of politics, I have seen de Blasio do that first movement to accommodate what appears on the surface as people of color against a white man. And the smoke and mirrors behind this is outrageous because the parents that have involvement are those that say, I want this school for my kid, which is a natural parental instinct. However, no child deserves the worst schools because they don't have parental involvement. I know kids that have to work the streets to bring home money for their parents' survival. You want to know what's going on in this country? Go to a classroom, a suburban, a rural, and an urban. You will get the picture. And the kids are connected to a disconnect. And in this age of celebrity, we need somebody like James Baldwin, because it breaks my heart to see what kids are under. The stress of the test. Even the kids that they say they don't care, they have a whole classroom of kids that have nervous breakdowns. These are the tough kids that they say they don't give a fuck about anything. They do. And their behavior, nobody wants to see behind the behavior, because the behavior is jaded. And I know this, because I've seen the changes. So it's not as simple as saying, I'm going to respect my elders. We have delivered a world to our children. I'm saying collectively that they don't deserve. They deserve better from us. And so we need James Baldwin. So anybody that wants to fit his footsteps, go ahead.
Well, I do want to correct one fact, which is that the administration did not reverse the co-locations because they weren't co-located back in the original schools that the Bloomberg administration had said they were going to put them in, which our administration said we wouldn't put them in because of its impact on the students already in those schools. There is a legal requirement for co-location, which is not completely under our control in the city. And I think the issue with charter schools is really complex because, and what I mean by this is, there are different ideological actions at work. It's not a monolith. There are the folks who are actually trying to incubate innovation that will go into the broader public school system, not trying to undermine the school system. And there are folks who are trying to undermine the school system. So I do think we have to distinguish and not treat all charters the same way and have a much more complex, what's the project? What is it that we're actually trying to do, and is it for all of our children? And some of those are projects that can potentially help all of our children, and some of them aren't. So rather than have we're just going to say all good or all bad, have a much more complex analysis about what's the impact. Does it undermine our ability to deliver an effective public education that creates critical thinking people who are able to engage one another in the joint project of developing a vibrant community of folks?
Having said that, I would agree with you, and I think you would agree with this too, Rich, that where Baldwin would focus today would be on the children.
Yeah.
That would be and by the way, on white children and black children.
I guess one thing I will say in response to all that's been said is that James Baldwin was always, like you said, concerned with the children, but he's also concerned with what's behind the veil, what's behind the mask, right? So what you said just now about we confront the children in classrooms and their behaviors or what we don't like, their pants are sagging, some people care about this, and no one asked the question, what happened to them? What do we do on our watch? Back to both of our points, right? And I think that's a more difficult question. And it implicates and indicts all of us. And so I think it's very easy to wag a moralizing finger, pull your pants up. As opposed to figure out what's going on in their imagination, in their minds. And if we care, if we're compassionate, that's part of the labor, right? To find the shared language, vocabulary, frequency, where we can hear each other. And back to the man's question over here. So that's what I mean by complex symmetry, right? It's not that you can meet me, Bill, word for word. But there's a real embrace of our young churches, and a real sense that that's all the hope we have.
I'm dying to call on you, sir, so I will.
Changing a little away from the children, but more the left-right discourse, it strikes me ongoingly. I come from France, and the National Front, the far right, recrudescence on and off, which is very worrisome. It strikes me ongoingly how much simpler it is to enunciate glibly sound bites when from the right than it is to address the complexities of those issues that are being glibly depicted when one is from the left. It's easy to say, immigrants take our jobs. It's much more complicated to counter such a glib argument. And I think the genius of the likes of Baldwin is to be able to simplify and enunciate truth, plural, in a very, very clear and understandable manner.
Yes.
And I think that the question that I may have is, how do we bring to the fore, be it in the press or be it in the liberal voices, a capacity to create, to counter, to send back the argument for a majority of people, whether they vote or not, who have the lack of capacity through education often, or the lack of sustained concentration in a culture that functions with sound bites, to counter those arguments that the right so effectively disseminates.
Well, this is what Karen and I both do. We're both communication strategists. So I'm going to let her go ahead. But there are people who are employed to do this.
But they seem to be failing.
We have our victories, actually, but and yes, sometimes we fail. I wish that Obama's communications team was anywhere near as good as the people who got him elected. And the other thing I would say is that I think that to some way, certainly the left contributes to this as well. James Baldwin couldn't get tenure anywhere these days. He's much too lucid. I also say this as someone with a PhD in English. From 1994, that the way that the left has chosen to, that there's a lot of really incoherent, super duper densey language that gets awarded in academia, and that is our fault. But please go ahead, Karen.
I guess what I would say is part of the problem has been progressives, liberals, whatever you want to say, will take the conservative argument and try to answer it, rather than proactively say, it is immoral that you would deny people Medicaid. I don't need to, right? I mean, it needs to be much more simple. I was communications director of the Democratic Party when Howard Dean was the chair, and he had no problem being very direct. And I do think it is something on the left where we're not as direct. And we've been on defense for a very, very long time. And I do think that there is a shift happening, but I think it's in small pieces. I think it's part of what my network is trying to do, frankly, and I think there are politicians who are trying to do it. But it's hard, and I think one of the things that I always wonder if Baldwin would, it would be hard to be a James Baldwin in this culture.
Yes. Oh, you could never finish a sentence on TV.
In addition to that, the backlash that you get and the cost for speaking truth to power is dramatically different than I think it was in his time.
And then there's, please go
well, no, because I think that in addition to because I think these points are really, really important. So this is both a hopeful point as well as a point to say it takes a long time. Because the right was way in the wilderness. I mean, the dominant narrative paradigm was not always dominant. And one of the differences, in fact, there's a great article called Before Brown. And so we were talking about the Southern strategy and Lee Atwater. Lee Atwater was a latecomer to this. Actually, that strategy started in 1928, is the beginning formations of the backlash to what people, because the New Deal was coming, right? So there was a deep ideological underpinning, ideological engagement and infighting to work out the ideological platform and to be willing to be in the wilderness for 40 years. To use biblical terms, because we're talking about James Baldwin and we should. But it was almost literally 40 years. And to say, we're going to keep saying this over and over and over again and driving and hammering our ideological points until it's dominant. The left has not, I shouldn't say never, but in recent decades, having won a lot of big victories, started becoming more reactive rather than holding an ideological center and saying standing up for it.
Let them question our values.
Well, and we've also siloed our ideology. So I would say I think there is a broad world view, but we've siloed into issues. And so that means that, well, you're going to talk about gay marriage, but I'm going to talk about affirmative action, rather than what's our ideological underpinning so that we're saying the same, because that's part of why we're having a hard time, both not just reacting and also simplifying a frame and a language.
I think the one positive that I would add to that, though, is the Moral Monday movement, which is having just been with Reverend Barber and Harry Belafonte last night at the Advancement Project Awards, and the Dream Defenders. Specifically, though, what I would say about the Moral Monday movement is, it's become a movement across gay people, women, working people, African American, Latino, because the underpinning is about morals and values, not left and right. I mean, they actually have Republicans in some very conservative areas in North Carolina saying, wait a second, that's too far for me, and joining their movement. So I would also offer, I think that's something Baldwin would be inspired by.
Yes.
And I think to the youth movement, I think he'd be inspired by, like the Dream Defenders, because they were the ones who stood up and said, why hasn't this guy been arrested for shooting Trayvon Martin? And they sat on the cold floor for 31 days, and Harry Belafonte was there with them, and as his responsibility to them, to show them the way, and to help make sure that they didn't falter, and that they didn't make the mistakes that, as he talked about last night, he made at 19 and 20. So I think I just offer that to say there are some positives. I just feel like we've been focusing a lot on very negative, and I think there are positive things happening, and I think people are starting to take some of this back. I do. And I think the important piece of it is it can't be a left-right conversation, right? It has to be about our values and about our morals.
There's a
one last thing.
Well, I just want to say that I think that one of the more brilliant essays I've read was by Ellen Willis called What's the Matter with Tom Frank, who of course wrote What's the Matter with Kansas, which was a bestseller about why do poor whites vote against their values. And Willis, who I think of as part of the Baldwin generation, incredibly well-educated, nuanced, articulate, also would have sucked at soundbite TV, basically says that the right believes what they're saying. The left claims to believe what we are saying, but do we really believe what we're saying about bodily autonomy? Do we really believe what we're saying about equality? Do we really have the courage of our convictions, or are we somehow psychologically divided against ourselves, and that our kind of ambivalence comes through, so that you get a movie like Juno, where the girl's talking about, like, they showed me the ultrasound and it had fingernails. Like, this is not something that happens on the right, and that in some ways the left's ambivalence about its own moral stance is what those people can smell, what makes them say, I don't want to be on that side. And I think that something like MSNBC, it is important to be speaking to the converted. The right knew to do it for ages, to create their own echo chamber, to instill conviction in people who they wanted to follow them. Thank you.
I'm glad we settled that. And I'm sorry, it is now 7:24. We were supposed to end, I think, at 6:45 or something. But we're here. Come on, talk to us. But we have to.
I know, and you have overwhelmed me, and I'm very, very happy for this. I would like to know that in this year of James Baldwin, when we reconvene in a year, at the end of the year, what will we have done to infuse James Baldwin in the path that we are going to walk when we leave here? I mean, is this, and I'm sorry, is this live act? Are you going to send out, what have you done? This is what you could have done. I'm politically active.
You're talking about follow-through, follow-up.
Yeah, follow-through.
Excuse me.
We have a lot in store for the year,
You
Baldwin.
have this 18-year-old young man sitting there, who I am sure is probably the youngest person sitting in this audience, and I applaud you.
Yes,
because I have a
absolutely.
grandson who's almost your age, who probably doesn't know who James Baldwin is, who couldn't put 10 words together in a sentence. So,
Naveen flew in from Michigan, by the way, for this. Solely for this. He flew in here for this. So.
We want other people who have similar convictions, which is something that does not often happen in the age of Facebook and Twitter, and we can actually all start talking to each other and exchanging cards and get our asses on the same page. So.
The power,
City too, that could be supported.
the power of the festival is that we are able to convene and strategize collectively and to unite. And so I encourage us to take these Baldwin themes into our lives as we exit the doors for what has been a beautifully heated, wonderful panel. Thank you to our lovely, amazing, brilliant panelists. Thank you all so much